On the Track is a web TV show about cryptozoology, natural history, green issues and whatever else the team feel like making up as they go along. Enjoy!
So, Rossiter, you having fun still down on your youth outreach project down there in Brixton?
Oh, Ken, it's bloody lovely. I am really enjoying this job.
And what type of shenanigans and silliness you been up to with them kids this week?
Well, I got too lazy to chew. I can't be bothered to chew, so I make them chew my food for me and then spit it into my mouth.
I don't know about you, but I think that is a particularly wise use of local government resources.
I really like the old credits.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to another episode of On the Track. I'm really amazed to see that we are now on episode 175, and that's not counting all the On the Track extras that we've done over the years. I think this is flabbergasting, and I really don't know how on earth we've managed it. But I don't want to sound like I'm blowing our own trumpet. And blowing our own trumpet would not be a gentlemanly thing to do. And whatever else the Centre for Fortean Zoology is, oh, and by the way, my name's John Downs, I'm the director of the Centre for Fortean Zoology. Whatever else the Centre for Fortean Zoology is, we do try to behave like gentlemen, some of the time at least. Now, for the last 30 years, the Centre for Fortean Zoology, because I can hear some of you out there thinking, well, what is this organisation? Who are you, you fat bloke with long hair, sitting in a chair in the middle of a room full of strange things? Well, my name's John Downs. I'm the director of the Centre for Fortean Zoology, which is an organisation which for the last 30 years has been doing research all over the world into mystery animals and things like that, cryptozoology and allied disciplines. And this is a show which comes out every Saturday afternoon, and we cover all sorts of exciting things, but it can pretty well be boiled down to hard science, weird shit, and surreality. And you want to know what surreality is? Well, I think you've already seen a bit of it with a chicken blowing a brown trumpet. But what are we going to be talking about this week? Well, this week I have my old friend Richard Freeman, who's the zoological director of the Centre for Fortean Zoology, and whom I have been friends with for over 25 years now. And I have my dear friend Richard Freeman sitting on the sofa, and I think if you look there when he's sitting on the sofa, he's half asleep cuddling the dog. And we're going to be talking about something very peculiar which over the years has been reported from various parts of South America, particularly the Mato Grosso. And so I think this is going to be a particularly exciting episode. So, without further ado, let's get on with it. So Richard, to start off with, what is it, why is it, and when is it?
The Minhocão is a monstrous serpentine beast from the folklore of the neotropics, particularly South America. and it is supposed to be this huge creature somewhere between a worm and a serpent that burrows underground, creating these great furrows, and it can uproot trees. It's so vast and powerful it can uproot trees and change the course of rivers, and when it bursts to the surface, like something out of Dune, it's supposed to have this great flat wedge shaped head and these weird little tentacles on the head in lieu of eyes, and great jaws with teeth. And it was reported throughout the 19th century and into the early 20th century, and then the sightings just seemed to vanish. Then about 20 years ago, 20 years ago, there was another report. I believe it was in Peru, if my memory serves me correctly, and it was a bunch of people playing football, and then the ground shook as if there were an earthquake, and the witnesses said this great black creature that twice the length of one of the big buses they have out of there emerged from the jungle, crushing vegetation, and it looked somewhere between a slug, a worm and a snake, this massive thing with little tentacles on its head that were moving round and round as it slithered along, and the people ran away from it. And that's the last I heard of it. There was no more investigations or follow-ups, but it's weird the way it appeared and then disappeared.
Isn't there also a story of something similar in, was it Dallas in Texas? Something, it was either Dallas or Houston.
Yes, there was
something came up from under
the... Yeah, but it was much, much smaller. That was about, I think, 20-25 feet long. This thing's supposed to have heaved up out of there. People thought there was gas or something trapped under the tarmac, because the tarmac sort of heaved up in this long sausage shape, and this thing burst out. And I can't remember if I'm misremembering this. I think it grabbed a cat and ate a cat. Or something, but it's once again it's one of these weird one-off things, and I don't think there was any follow-up to it. Unlike in the South American cases with the Minhocão, there were a number of reported cases from the early 19th century and through the 19th century, and I think there was some in the early 20th century, and then they just stopped. These reports stopped, and then there was this weird outlier about 20 years ago.
What are the theories for what it might be?
Well, Bernard Heuvelmans thought that it might be surviving glyptodonts. These are giant armadillos. They're about the size of a Volkswagen Beetle. There were several different types. Some of them had clubs on their tails like ankylosaur dinosaurs. In fact, you could think of them as the mammalian equivalent of ankylosaurs. And these giant armadillos that were herbivores, unlike today's armadillos, which feed mostly on invertebrates, but they will take fruit as well. And bizarrely, they've even been known to attack newborn calves and lambs, which I wouldn't have believed unless I'd seen the film of it. But glyptodonts, as far as we know, were purely herbivorous. But they made these great long burrows, and Heuvelmans' theory is that these things had survived, and the great long burrows were these furrows that were attributed to the Minhocão. Now the trouble with that is that a glyptodont doesn't look anything like the description of the Minhocão. It's a rounded, armoured, giant armadillo the size of a car. It's not this monstrously long, slimy serpentine thing.
One of the theories about this elusive creature that's always interested me is the idea that it's some sort of caecilian. So Richard, could you and Archie explain what is a caecilian?
Caecilians are amphibians. They are worm-like, and if you saw them and didn't know what they were, you would almost certainly think that they were some sort of annelid worm, but they're actually amphibians, and there are many different species. Some of them live underground, some of them live in leaf litter, and some of them live in water.
The amphibians, or the ones that are still alive today, can be divided into three groups. The anurans, frogs and toads, the chordata, the tailed amphibians, and the caecilians, strange worm-like creatures which are little known even to experienced zoologists. Now, the CFZ have been very interested in caecilians for a long time, and we've kept 2 different species. Indeed, we had a very successful colony of Rheococcus caecilians, which we bred up until the 4th generation, being, as far as I'm aware, the only people in Britain to ever have done so. However, unfortunately, a power cut in the middle of one winter destroyed the colony, and I was totally bereft, and so was Graham, because it'd been Graham mostly who'd been looking after them. But Richard, what do you think about the idea of the how do you pronounce it?
Minhocão.
Minhocão being a giant caecilian?
Now, there are superficial similarities. These little tentacles on its head are very like the little feelers that caecilians have. But the biggest caecilian is something, I think, like 4.5 feet long. And
bit larger than that, about 5.5, but yeah.
But they're still quite a substantial thing there.
Just under 2 metres.
Yeah, imagine seeing one of those wriggling about. It'd be amazing, wouldn't it?
And guess what? It's bright pink.
But that's a long way from the Minhocão, which is supposed to be upwards of 100 feet long. It's a monstrous thing, and thicker around than a car, and 100 feet long. The size difference is just so unbelievably vast. And I think the biggest amphibian, now, I think the biggest amphibian, if memory serves, that ever lived was something called Mastodonsaurus, which was neither a mastodon or a dinosaur. It was a giant amphibian from the Carboniferous, but that was only about 25-30 feet long.
When you have reports of creatures this immense, and one has to remember that the largest creature, the largest vertebrate ever known to exist, is still with us today, it's the blue whale. But when you have reports of animals this big, do you think this casts doubt upon the sightings, or do you think people are exaggerating either intentionally or unintentionally what they've seen?
Well, you have to wonder what an animal like this feeds on. If it's as big as that, why isn't it seen more often? What does it feed on? If it's a subterranean animal, most subterranean animals are very small, like the way that troglodytes are generally very small, because there's not much prey. For a meat-eating animal, there's not much prey down there. South America used to be full of megafauna, giant ground sloths and giant armadillos, and then when it joined up with the Isthmus of Panama, you got the mixture of faunas. So you got horses coming down and other creatures like that, and it was almost like Africa. It's like the savannas of Africa for megafauna. You had Maracainia, which was this great long-necked, moose-headed herbivorous mammal, and a big predator could have fed on them, but they've all disappeared. So if it's a real animal, what's it feeding on, or where does it disappear to when it's not being seen? If this was in the oceans, you could say, yeah, it's lots of places for it to hide, but it's utterly baffling. The Minhocão is one of those things that just leaves me scratching my head, because it doesn't make sense.
Isn't there also a theory that it might be a fish?
Some people have equated these little tentacle antenna things it has on its head to the barbels of a catfish, which is not an unreasonable comparison, and some people say it might be some huge species of catfish, because catfish do estivate in the mud, and you know, the biggest catfish, the Wells catfish, can be over 3 meters long, and there are stories of bigger ones, and there are certainly big catfish in South America, but they couldn't topple over trees or change the courses of rivers or make the earth shake like it was an earthquake.
So really, despite the fact that this is something which has intrigued both of us for an awful long time, there's very little known about it, practically no evidence apart from anecdotal evidence, and even some of that's fairly sketchy. So it's got to be one of these ones that is going to be put into the Lord alone knows what it is, and we'll have to wait and see what happens file.
Yeah, if it's a flesh and blood animal. If you want to go down the supernatural track, the paranormal track, then all bets are off.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, I don't know if you know this, but until the latter half of the 1990s, I was a gigging rock musician, singing with a band called John Dan's and the Amphibians from Outer Space. We made a few records that not many people actually bought, and we had a reasonable following in some of the more sophisticated flesh pots of South and Mid Devon. We were really big in Newton Abbot, for example. And much to my surprise, this week I had an email from a guy who'd been in the band for about 5 minutes, best part of 30 years ago, and whom I have to admit I'd almost completely forgotten about. But he wrote to me and he said that he would love to hear studio recordings of some of the old songs we used to play together, and were there any? And I wrote back and said that I was vaguely thinking about re-recording some of them because the original recordings were so bad, but I hadn't actually done so. Now, hold that thought, because I now want to take you back to Loch Ness, because as I've explained to you all on a number of occasions recently, 30 years ago, pretty well to the day, to today, I was up in the north of Scotland with my first wife, Alison, and a bunch of people with whom I had been touring with a rock band you may well have heard of called Steve Harley and Cockney Rebel. And we went off to Loch Ness and spent a few days there, and it was whilst I was sitting on the shores of Loch Ness, sitting on a large stone, smoking a suspiciously large cigarette and vaguely gazing into the middle distance, that I came up with the idea of starting the Centre for Fortean Zoology. A day or two before, however, we'd been in Inverness, and we came upon a really large flea market, and I bought a number of books which were to influence the way I was thinking. One of these books, and the one which I don't usually talk about because it doesn't really affect my professional development, was one of the paperback collections of Billy Bunter stories by Frank Richards. And whilst I was sat on the shores of Loch Ness, on another day, but only a day or so later, still sat on the same stone, still staring to the middle distance at Boleskine House, which was Alistair Crowley's old gaff on the shores, on the hills above the other side of the lake, I came up with this very peculiar idea about the four horsemen of the apocalypse. What would happen if they had been fat and it had been the four fat men of the apocalypse? And I came up with this totally complicated rigmarole of a scenario involving Billy Bunter, Alistair Crowley and the four fat men of the apocalypse. And a few months later I remembered it all and I wrote it into a song. This one's for you, Michael.
The four fat men of the apocalypse kept riding from the west in search of blood and girls and food, sex and money. Playing and becoming the woman sick on, I guess you know the rest. They all came riding up to the barman and said, look here, honey, it's been 40 days and 40 months and have something to eat. You look like you're a pretty nice girl to me. Well, you look like you're a nice girl, you look like you're quite sweet, and you can still go down to the end of the time, back in time for tea. Billy Bunter said, if you wanna be free, just get out of your head, come down to the tree. Billy Bunter said, if you wanna be kind, there's only one thing to do, be school your mind. If you wanna be free, come on, and listen. Billy Bunter said, if you do what you're told, you can be like a child, you can never grow old. Be like a child, you can never grow old. Go around the crowd and laughing, you just disagree with the human beings really definitely. And then he told us all to go in search of a place where no one sinned, and then he said a bit more that didn't make sense to me. And so I left the early seekers after truth and went my way in search of magic potions that might make me thinner. But I found that goddamn pharmacist had simply gone away to mix some cocktails and some politics over dinner. Billy Bunter said, if you want to be free, just get out of my head and get down to the factory. Billy Bunter said, if you want to be kind, there's only one thing to do, de-school your life. If you want to be free, Billy Bunter said, now listen. Billy Bunter said, if you do what you're told, you can be like a child, you can never grow old. You can be like a child, you can never grow old. Come on, some kind of crowd show, they said it's simply weird, and the world gets more confusing every day. They said this double helix is secreted in this beard, my second tour is just threw it away. And 420 babies walking down from the nest to try and catch an invitation from the beast. And when they found out there was nothing they could repossess, the four fat men disappeared into the east. Billy Bunter said, you want to be free, just put your out of your hair and come down to the tree. Billy Bunter said, you want to be kind, there's only one thing to do, de-school your mind. Billy Bunter said, you just got to listen. Billy Bunter said, if you do what you're told, you can be like a child, you can never grow old. Be like a child, you can never grow old. Billy Bunter said, you want to be free, just put your out of your hair and come down to the tree. Billy Bunter said, you want to be kind, there's only one thing to do, de-school your mind. Billy Bunter said, you just got to listen. Billy Bunter said, you can do what you're told, you can be like a child, you can never grow old. Be like a child, you can never grow old. Go, Max.
if you want to support us and help us make more content like these, please press like, subscribe, follow our Facebook page and check out our Patreon.
And as the ghost of Joe Strummer, who's an ever more regular visitor to my little studio, wants me to remind you, always press the notification bell. Otherwise you won't be told when there's a new show to watch. And that would be an awful pity, wouldn't it? Well, ladies and gentlemen, we're here at the end of another episode. I hope you enjoyed it and found it educational, edifying, entertaining, and give me another word beginning with E, Richard.
Ecstatic.
Ecstatic and enervating. Richard and I have had great fun doing this episode. It was only while we were rendering down the video for Billy Bunter Said last night that I realised how young people today would not understand a series of books about a fat, lazy schoolboy being beaten up by his peers, because they would, I'm sure, call it fat shaming or bozzy negativity or something. And maybe they're right, I don't know. I'm not really going to get into that argument here, but it is quite peculiar. Thank you very much to everybody who's worked on this episode with me. In fact, he's here. This whole episode was put together by me and Richard, starting yesterday afternoon, yesterday evening, and finishing off now. So, Richard, will you wave languidly and appreciatively at your audience? And there's nothing much I can say about that. We'll be back next Saturday, and if you can't wait till next Saturday, there's an On the Track Extra coming out on Wednesday. I can't remember what it's about, but I remember it being rather a good one. So, all that remains for me is to say, come along next Saturday afternoon and see me and maybe Richard, I don't know, and we'll be here doing jollity stuff. So, until then, what the hell are you doing, Richard? Looks like you're being some sort of weird sea anemone. Be seeing you.